Hello. In this video we will be talking about heredity. In this video we will also be talking about Punnett squares, genotypes and phenotypes, Mendelian versus non-Mendelian in traits, complete and non-complete dominance, codominance, sex-linked traits, multiple alleles, and multiple genes. So, first we have what is an allele and what makes an allele dominant or recessive. So, an allele is basically a part of a trait. You inherit one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad. And these alleles generally can be either dominant or recessive. Now, what dominant and recessive means is this is parent 1 and this is parent 2. You could inherit a dominant trait from your dad and a dominant trait from your mom, in which case you would get two dominant traits and you would only be able to pass down dominant traits to your children. And same thing goes with if you get two recessive traits. But if you get a dominant from one parent and a recessive trait from the other, then in a dominant and recessive relationship, then the dominant will overpower the recessive trait and you will have the dominant trait showing as your phenotype. Now, what is a phenotype? Well, a phenotype is the trait you show on the outside. For instance, if you have blonde or brown hair, as opposed to a genotype, which is what the coding in your genes says. So for instance, you might have brown hair, but that could mean, since that's a dominant trait over blonde hair, that could mean you in your genotype you either have two big D's or a big D and a little d showing brown hair as your phenotype. Now, let's look at this tool I'm using right here. This is a Punnett square, and Punnett squares come in a few different varieties. We were looking at one specific pair of alleles here, or big D and little d, but what if, so I used a monohybrid thing for this. So there is one variation. There are two possible traits you could have for either parent. But if you have, say, two, then that would be a dihybrid Punnett square. So you would have big A, big B, big A, little b, big B, or little a, little b for both traits. It's for both parents, and it would be every single possible matching. And so every single possible matching, and you would get one of these from each parent. One of these possibilities from each parent. Now, the example I showed you earlier of how traits work is a bit imprecise in certain circumstances. Now, in some cases, you do have complete dominance, which is what we showed here. Or if you have a big D and a little d, which is heterozygous, as opposed to big D or little d's homozygous traits, then in complete dominance, the big D would completely overpower that one, and you would only be showing the dominant trait. 8. But there's also non-Mendelian traits like codominance. In codominance, you obviously, if you're homozygous as big D or homozygous recessive, then it's the obvious answer. But if you're heterozygous, instead of that being completely overpowered, you will show both D and big D and little d. So you will be shown both of those traits. showing both of those traits. If you have a white rose as the big D, or a red rose as a big D, and a blue rose as the little d, and then you had a rose with big D, little d, then it would be blue and red. It'd be a blue and red rose. This is opposed to incomplete dominance, which you would obviously have the big D, and you would obviously have the little d, but since it can't fully overpower the other one, instead of doing something like being both big D, having both big D and little d, it would be sort of a hybrid D. It's kind of big D, it's kind of little d. So if somebody had white hair and that was dominant, and somebody had black hair and that was recessive, then and somebody with heterozygous with incomplete dominance would have sort of gray hair because it's kind of in the middle. Another type of non-Mendelian trait is sex-linked traits. So your genotype is on your chromosomes. That's where it's stored. And for chromosomes 1 through 22 of your 23 chromosomes, your chromosomes are the same for both male and females. But on the 23rd chromosome, females have 2 of these X chromosomes, while males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And if a trait is only shown on say the X chromosome and not on the Y chromosome, then different sexes experience that certain trait differently depending on their sex. So how this works out is, this is your father in this case, and this is your mother. So there is a 50-50 chance of either one of these traits coming out. Now, if you have XX, then you are a girl, and if you have XY, then you are a boy. So these are going to be the girls, and these are going to be the boys. These are going to be females, these are going to be males. So, let's say your dad has big H, which means he does not have the trait that causes hemophilia, which is a trait that prevents blood clotting. But your mom has one dominant H, which means no hemophilia, but she also has a little h, which means she does carry and has the potential to pass on hemophilia. Now, I'll look at these graphs. If it's XX, if it's this X, then no matter what, the big H will always overpower the little h in this circumstance. And there is no possibility where there is only little h's left, and the girls would have the symptoms of hemophilia. But if it was a boy, if it was a male with these traits, then there would be a 50% chance whether the mother passed on the big H or the little h, and there'd be a 50% chance and where the male child does have hemophilia. Now, so far we have only covered where we only have one trait. So, for instance, in this case, we had one trait being shown. One possible thing. There are 2 possible outcomes: big D or little d per gene. But sometimes you have more than 2 possibilities. You might have, for instance, blood type, you might have A, you might have an A, or you might have a or you might have a B as, or you might have a B, or you might have neither of those, and that would be an O. So what happens then is, let's say you have heterozygous A from parent 1 and heterozygous B from parent 2. That would be an A and an O and a B and an O. Since this specific example is codominant, this is an example of codominance. If you get both A and B, it would be A and B, not they don't overpower each other. But sometimes you do experience cases where there are more than two possibilities. And in this specific scenario, A and B are codominant, but they are dominant. Both of them are dominant compared to O. So if it's B and O, then it will be B. If it's A and O, then it will be A. But if it's A and B, then it will be A and B. And if it's O and O, then it will be O. And sometimes there might be, compared to having multiple alleles, there also might be, this is a separate concept from multiple alleles entirely. Multiple genes, also called polygenetic traits when dealing with the phenotypes, is where multiple genes might influence a specific phenotype. For instance, if somebody had for one trait two dominant A's, they were homozygous in that area, that might say they might say they have brown hair. But over here, they might have two little B's over here. And if they have two little B's over here in this different trait, that also might influence their hair. And that might say, no, they're going to be slightly more blonde. And so it would be in this scenario, both of these influence your hairstyle, what color of hair you end up having with your phenotype. So this would be around a dirty blonde, or somewhere around that. And that is my video about heredity. If you have any further questions, please feel free to ask them. Thank you.